welcome everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Innovation Agora session on the digitalization and transformation of oil and gas. So I actually had the pleasure of hosting and moderating a similar panel this last year. So it's great to have an opportunity to kind of check in to see how the industry has progressed over the last year. And Vivek was actually a panelist on that one as well. So you're here to keep us honest, right?
I will try.
Fantastic. So if anything, what we've seen is that the momentum from last year of kind of digitalization, automation technologies has really begun to accelerate. I remember last year when Dan Yergin first spoke the word data-driven subsurface models, that was one of the first to come out of his mouth. And we've continued to see this, this kind of momentum, this kind of encouragement around kind of what we're beginning to see around digitalization. And if anything, it's really striking to see how the portfolios of a lot of companies have really shifted from some of these core E&P technologies and increasingly to digitalization and automation. And it's perhaps not surprising, though, especially as you begin to see the business conditions at play, as companies are focusing on cost management, efficiency, as well as trying to scale technologies very quickly, and also trying to reduce the capital intensity of the money that they're spending as well. So digitalization fits in really well to be able to kind of address some of those issues. So I've had an opportunity to attend some of the Agora sessions over the last couple days, and there's been a lot of great ones, and focus on some of the discrete topics as well, kind of around blockchain, artificial intelligence, robotics, cloud, and some of the other ones. What we wanted to do with this session was to elevate it a little bit, and to really understand what digitalization means for the upstream oil and gas sector, or for the oil and gas sector, as well as the progress we're beginning to make, where the value lies, and then what are the best success factors in kind of making this and actually achieving some of this value. So to do that, we've got a great panel together, and I'll kind of start from my left, and we've got Vivek Chindaramba, Managing Director with Accenture. We've got Babur Ozden, who's the founder and CEO of Maana, which is a startup. So it's great to have you here as well. We've got Jonathan Crane, who is the Vice President of Wells Technology Deployment. And John, I think your title may be updated as well now to kind of reflect more of a kind of digitalization role.
Yeah, I'm trying to invent one, but I think digital delivery is my
digital delivery.
Is my
okay. And then we have Wan Shamila Saidi, who is the Chief Digital Officer with Petronas. And then we have Arshad Mantan as well, who is the President in E&P software, the E&P software business for Emerson, and recently joined Emerson as well within the last few months or so. So we've got a really diverse panel, and we're going to explore a number of different issues. But one of the things that I want to start off with to kind of get us on the right page and kind of begin to think about this, Shamila, I'm going to turn to you. And so you're the Chief Digital Officer at Petronas, and so that's a new role that's kind of been created in the industry over the last few years. So maybe you could enlighten us on kind of what your responsibilities are, as well as what some of the decisions that you're making and some of the things that you're thinking about for the organization.
Thank you, Joseph. Yes, it's a new role in Petronas. I assumed the role early last year, so it's just about a year in. And I think the need for the role arises because we saw a lot of efforts across Petronas to pursue digital and to deploy digital, and it's scattered. And we feel it hinders creating real impact at pace. So my role is really to orchestrate the digital transformation, and we see digital in Petronas as a business transformation. Digital is an enabler. It accelerates impact and pace of the business strategies. So we try, my role is to orchestrate, and in doing that, we try very hard to make sure that we focus our efforts on projects or pilots that we can scale across the group. And we are an integrated value chain. And why that is very important to us is because if you can scale it across all our 20 to 30 plants, across all our hundreds of wells, now that to us is how you really can unlock value from digital.
Excellent, okay. And we're going to get to what are the key success factors that are going to allow you to do that. But I did want to turn now to John Crane. And John, within your roles, you have a slightly more constrained scope of responsibility. So you're focusing on a discrete functional activity around drilling, around well construction. What does that mean? So what does digital transformation mean in a particular functional activity, and how are you kind of going after that?
Yeah, just to give you a bit of context, so I work for the Wells organization of Shell, and as a business, we spend about a third of the capital that Shell spends, so it's about a $7 billion a year business. And my role is kind of turning the strategy of digital into reality, and part of that is a bit of focus on value and not novelty. So one of the things we did about 3 years ago was we used an iPad to control a drilling rig that was directionally drilling in Appalachia. And it's a fantastic piece of integrated technology and a sort of digital value chain. But in fact, we realized it's kind of rubbish of generating money. And I think there's a lot in the digital space is kind of recognizing where the value is. To translate it for Wells, what we said was that the drilling business has a design process and an execution process. And we said, in the design process, we wanted that to be substantially autonomous. And why do we want to do that? Well, to improve the quality of design, but also to reduce the cycle time. The other thing is we wanted to play a supply chain game of a better demand prediction by being able to detail out early. And that's kind of unusual if you look at digital transformations. You know, we're not talking about equipment at the fringes of our business, but we're talking about really the core of what makes well engineering. And the other thing we said was that we wanted our operational decisions to be data-driven. So we wanted to use artificial intelligence to drive our operational performance. And we kind of set off on that journey, and we have about 80 prototypes running in the execution space, looking at providing advice. And why does that work? Because the average human being can't really hold the volume of data in order to make a good statistical decision. And so how can we adjunct in that space? It's interesting about why now? Why this transformation in this particular phase? And in fact, I did an experiment by accident. As I pitched digital about 5 years ago to my own organization and failed miserably. In fact, it's one of those things, who should you fire? You should fire the people who have the vision but can't make it happen. But what has changed in the meantime? And I think the oil price stress has caused us to rethink our business, and so get to another level of detail of control and cost. The other thing is that artificial intelligence has become a lot more available in the last 5 or 6 years, and so we can put tools in the hands of our engineers that weren't possible before. And kind of where are we going this? We want to remove the fog and the friction that we have organizationally. If you sit in an organization, you're trying to make a rational decision about production or cash flow, but you're a long way down the engineering chain, it's really quite difficult. But I think, one of the exciting things about digital, it lifts you up and you can see further as a result. I think the other thing about digital is the opportunity, and Shamila alluded to it, is that you can use it to unleash creativity. So when you go to the organization and say, I want you to be digital, and you give the opportunity to rethink how they want to operate. We did this with Drilling the Limit in the 2000s. And there we said, if physics is the only thing that stops you from drilling a well efficiently, how would you do it? What happened, and I was a young engineer at the time, is it opened up a creativity, and it changed the rules. My boss couldn't say no anymore. We had to have a discussion. And I think digital gives us the same opportunity to do that, and it's a real transformational thing. I think the other thing, Judson, you said, digital where next was the title of the piece, and what I see is like a hierarchy. So quite often people start with a vision, and then suddenly you get into a debate about data, and some people get stuck in that level. Then there's a sort of a proof of concept piece where people do point solutions, and then they realize that in order to scale, you need a platform that goes across, the whole thing. And then once you've got the platform, you suddenly realize I can't deliver AI on the expensive. I need to do it on the cheap. And so it's about how do I deliver AI cost effectively. Yeah, so that's my piece.
Okay. So you touched on a lot. We're going to come back to a lot of those things, John, as well. So. But one of the things, Arshad, I think you're in a great position. I think we've kind of started with Shamila from the very broad, and we'll dig into some of where the opportunities are, and then John's looking at a very specific functional activity and trying to understand how to optimize that and how to improve that. Spending $7 billion a year, is that right, John?
Small business.
Just a small business, exactly. Arshad, you're probably in a good position to understand, where does the value lie? Does the value lie in kind of improving some of the specific things that we're doing right now? Or is the value at the interfaces? How do you begin to think about how to integrate and how to kind of work across some of these boundaries in some of these interfaces?
Yeah, well, I think when you talk about digital and digital transformation in oil and gas, it's a very broad area, right? So go from exploration all the way to downstream. You've got subsurface, surface. So what I'm going to do is going to pick more kind of the place where I've spent my last few years with Emerson/Paradigm and IHS before that.
That's right.
From our vantage point, and just for context, where we play in upstream is sort of tying the subsurface knowledge that exists in the reservoir at the reservoir level with production optimization, right? So if you think about where value has been created or is created in the whole value chain, you've got to get the reservoir right, right? So I mean, you can be the best operator in the world, you may have the best balance sheet, you may have the best logistics, but if you get the subsurface wrong, none of that helps. So our view is that you've got to get the subsurface right, you've got the reservoir right. Now that's a field that has been well developed for a long time. I mean, that's one of the areas where this industry has spent a lot of money in software, in computing, in visualization for years. So that's not new. In fact, 20 years ago, there was an effort for open data structure. IBM was involved, and a lot of other companies were involved. So that has been around for a long time. What's different now is suddenly that island of sort of digital competency in this industry has the opportunity to connect itself to a much broader footprint in digital, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is where we believe is some amazing opportunities, and it is through integration, right? So you want to integrate your subsurface knowledge with your production knowledge. Mm-hmm. You cannot optimize a well at the wellhead just by looking at readings coming out of the equipment, as well as if you were to combine that with the subsurface knowledge, how other wells are working in context of that well, in that reservoir over time. So we see enormous opportunities, frankly, over the next many years to tie the subsurface knowledge in a holistic way with a lot of different programs, whether it's well construction, whether it's drilling, whether it's production optimization, whether it's surveillance of the field. All of those things ultimately connect to the reservoir.
Yeah,
and we believe that the industry is ready with all the advances that have taken place in computing infrastructure, in communications, and the ability to actually bring it all together through the cloud platform would be the next frontier, we believe, to bring that to the next level.
Excellent. So I love the announcement of the islands. So we're kind of going from the islands now to kind of connecting, making bridges across them. Yeah. And Babur, I know that you get a chance to work with lots of different companies, and you kind of have you kind of see what state they're in as you kind of go work with them. When you work with a company and you kind of look at connecting some of these islands, looking at analytics and how we can derive value, what do you see as what are the companies that are in the best shape, and what are the indicators that a company is ready to start this digitalization versus maybe it's not ready to start?
It's going to be hard to answer sitting between two of my investors here, Shell and Accenture. But,
do your best, don't worry.
I would. I didn't bring notes for that. So just before I answer that, from the point of view that we see as a common practice, is that the most successful pursuits are, when you use the word digital, it needs to disrupt something. It's not doing more of the same thing more efficiently or more cost effectively. You need to find a way to disrupt something. So just to give an example, if we held this conference 20 years ago, most of us here would call travel agents to be able to find places to get here, fly here. Today, I'm sure most of us do it by ourselves. We just went to a website, did everything all ourselves. So digital something disrupted some industry or the way something was done. And I see it among our customers and potential customers when they tackle their digital projects to disrupt something in a positive way. Mm-hmm. So that needs to be, I think, a part of the mix. And that disruption should sort of happen, what we call it a digital honeymoon period in my customers. There is this ambitions to do things in digital. As you say, everybody starts scattered. That's how it started. But then when everyone gets their act together, there's this period of things that it needs to deliver results. That those results, regrettably, but in a right way, still measured with balance sheets, financial statements. It needs to have a direct impact to one of those. So anything that's planned in that fashion, disruptive, major outcome, a quick, major, scalable result, not low-hanging fruits, usually lead to success. That's what we see.
Okay, that sounds great. So Vivek, and I know that you've been involved in quite a few projects as well, and you get a chance to look across the industry. So, I guess, we're at the point where we've been looking at digitalization for a long period of time. Obviously, the industry has been on this way, but we also went through a wave probably back in the 2000s as well. So what's different this time? And I know Arshad talked about some of the technologies and cloud and the other things, but what do you find to be different in this current focus on digitalization versus what we were doing back in the 2000s?
Yeah. I think several things, Judd. Part of it is that the industry structure itself has changed. If we think about any commodity or product over time, the cost of it has gone down. And I think of it in times of more than 10, 20 years, right? 100-year time periods. And we have hit the point where the cost structure of the industry has to dramatically change. And the way that I tend to look at that is asset utilization. As an industry, do we utilize our assets as efficiently as we can? On the OFS side, and if I think of a reservoir as an asset, do I use that as best as I can? Mm-hmm. And we have arrived at the point where we as an industry believe that this structure will continue to collapse in terms of price pressure going forward. As that has happened, lots of technologies have come in which say, if you start to rethink the way that I'm doing work, I can move the position of the industry. And these are starting to intersect. And they're starting to intersect in several distinct spaces. They're starting to intersect in the space of automation, and we see a huge digitization wave in the automation space. Mm-hmm. They're starting to intersect in the space of augmentation of human capabilities, right? Decision making. If I start to look at the decisions that we make and think about how digitization and digital transformation change those specific decisions, there are short-term decisions, medium-term decisions, and long-term decisions that all can be dramatically changed. So now, if I start to intersect those two, you see something different than 20 years back, 10 years back, even 5 years back. And I think Jonathan said that when he proposed it 5 years back, you didn't get the same impact that you get today, because those decisions can be changed today, and they couldn't effectively be changed 5 years back.
Got it. Okay. So that and that's and we're talking about so there's a range of decisions, there's a range of opportunities as well. Maybe let's drill down a little bit into some of the concrete. And I know, Shamila, you've been at this for a year. You've been kind of had an opportunity to develop a strategy, and now you're kind of looking at some of the opportunities. How do you go about prioritizing, number one? And Babur, kind of mentioned some of those types of how to prioritize. But where do you see the opportunities? And maybe just as important is, where don't you see the opportunities? Are there things that you want to focus on initially, and then what might you kind of put off to the side for a while?
Oh, that's simply enormous opportunity. Just take HSC, for example, it's our top priority area. Now, how do you use analytics to really go deep into past incidents and use it to re-engineer or redesign our work processes so that the work environment will be safer? So HSC is an area that we're looking at. Productivity, efficiency, and visibility of performance at our operations, plants, and wells. Really, again, using predictive analytics so that we can really see step change in the performance of our plants and our wells. Yeah. Using artificial intelligence to really anchor and retain corporate knowledge, because we found that a lot of our corporate knowledge is in unstructured data, and that's really hard for us to leverage upon, and now we can. So there's simply enormous opportunity, but for us actually, digital is quite simply to us new ways of working, and in order to make a success of a digital transformation, it is to us about the culture and mindset of the people. So we actually spend a lot of time evangelizing digital fluency across the group, getting people to embrace it, be excited about it, because to us, if we can raise the level of understanding throughout the group, deploying digital tools and solution is actually the consequence. So we actually approach it through culture and mindset.
Culture. So do you find that there are certain groups that are more receptive to a change in culture, whether it's a functional group, upstream, downstream, functional, young, old, however you want to classify it?
Actually, the level of uptake is very high across the group at various levels as well, especially the young, I must say. The level of uptake is very high. And as we do this pilots that we see has really high potential for scaling, and they see how we showcase how to approach it and the potential value, actually we find it very liberating for them, and they get very excited and want to get involved.
Excellent. Okay. What do you find, John? So you drillers, and the reputation for being crusty old men and women as well. But to their credit, they actually are one of the quickest adopters we find of new technology as well. If it works, then they're quite receptive to it. So what do you see in terms of do you find that 5 years on now you're actually finding that the well construction, the drillers are receptive to this?
Yeah, we've done workshops all around the world looking at this with our teams, and what worries me actually is more the amount of energy and the hunger for change. And I think the reason is because if you look at your home life and how digital it is, and then you type in the office and you go, oh my goodness, that's the way we operate. In terms of where we're sort of focusing, there's a really boring bit of digital which says, I need to stabilize my processes, and then I need to put like a digital layer on top. And it's like your infrastructure you need. And then we said, okay, the clever thing is at the interfaces. That's probably where we are making money. So when we're discussing choices, how do we get a really rich input from finance, from tax, from petroleum engineering and drilling? How do you get that transparency of discussion? The other is with our suppliers. How do we get a really good interaction with our suppliers? Can we publish our activity down to a real level of detail for the next 24 months so that we can have a really good supply chain interaction? And the other one, which is really rich for us, is the delivery of instructions. So if you look at the way that we try and instruct people to do things, it's really, really primitive. We'll send 6 inches of paper to a drilling rig who'll probably put it in the bin and write their own stuff. And so how do you get to a clever delivery of knowledge in the moment? How do you get sort of social sharing of knowledge? How do you get people to take videos and share and learn? Because I suspect, it's probably a universal industrial problem. Each geographic location learns on its own, and it's hard to sort of spread that. So those are kind of the areas we're playing with.
Okay. And you mentioned a couple times now around kind of the interfaces to suppliers, and this is something I really want to dig into quite a bit. But Vivek, when you look at this opportunity and you're going in and you're working with the company, where do you see the interfaces? How do you where do you say it makes sense to kind of go solo versus where do you want to focus on? Either we need partners to help develop this, or where's the opportunity to interface with suppliers to get more value?
Yeah, as I've looked at multiple digital transformations, Judd, and not just digitizing certain processes, but transformations, companies have taken different approaches to it, right? Some have said, look, I want to get the platform right. Others have said, look, I need to get the analytics right, and I'm going to focus on the analytics. Others say, I'm going to get a whole bunch of POCs in place. But if you boiled up these different approaches and said, what's common to it? Culture is common. Getting people and processes to work is common. And using the ecosystem more effectively is common. This is, again, something that has changed significantly in the last 10 odd years, right? The ecosystem isn't the traditional ecosystem anymore. There are a whole number of startups, one sitting next to me, that have dramatically changed the way in which data can be processed. Now, they do that across multiple industries. They are irreverent to some of our silos within our industry in terms of exploration, development, and production, and who has what. And so they come in and say, look, I'm agnostic to that. I can put data across these silos, and all of the interface losses that I have, I can go and change that. And that use of that ecosystem is another dramatic lever that is different in terms of digital transformation. The companies that truly transform depend a lot on the ecosystem. It's less about what I can do, and it becomes a lot about what I should do and what I should depend on somebody else to do.
Okay. And where do you see it? So, Babur, when you go into this and you're working on a project, you know, obviously you're coming at this from a particular technology perspective, but where do you see the opportunities? And as you've worked with companies, you get an opportunity to kind of look across. Where have you seen companies be successful in some of these initiatives, and where have they struggled? Because that's, you know, we had an interesting comment. I was in a session yesterday, and a service company was asking the question, and one is very knowledgeable about this, but he asked the question, you know, are we getting value today, or are we investing for technology tomorrow? You know, because he's not convinced. He wasn't convinced that we're actually getting value. So where do you, as you kind of begin to look at the tools you're developing around analytics, as you begin to look at some of these interfaces and working with suppliers, where are companies actually getting value today?
So I see our customers in, again, this is a very early era in digitization. So the customers that we work, I believe, are trailblazers in this space. And I'm hoping there's not a huge gap of the mainstream adopters afterwards, because otherwise, as a startup, we're gone. So we have to be. But in this group of trailblazers, there is almost a mystical belief, and if I can interpret it that way, if you can somehow eliminate the silo effect, somehow, without eliminating the silos, and then somehow magically combine all of that data into a new ways and shapes and open it up to everybody, there will be phenomenal things happen. So that's, I see that as the non-quantifiable drive that management or leadership has. There's some belief in that. And when that can be proven that's the case, it is actually extremely powerful. So we see companies that have digital organizations almost always try to build a new digital stack, new platform, which is very separate than your transactional, operational, and enterprise environment. And this digital stack today, it comes with an ecosystem of vendors. Some customers are hosting their digital stacks in cloud, so the fear of cloud is disappearing. And the cloud itself brings marvelous things to scale and cost of computation and storage to be able to do analytics. And then people start taking really specific use cases to improve decision making. And that's the kind of thing that we see. Company wants to build a digital stack, builds in partnership with an ecosystem of vendors, big and small like us, and then has a roadmap of use cases, and goes and executes one after another in a very specific fashion. They want to develop something, see if it's working. If it's not working, scrap it, move to the next one.
Okay.
So what I see at the foundations is that really, at the end of the day, the most successful in the space, one, takes that digital stack very seriously because of it will become enterprise-wide, not departmental, and it needs to scale. Second is that if you don't have a rich set of roadmap of use cases, because your first 2, 3, what are you going to do 4th, 5th, 6th? So I know, especially my customer sitting to my left, has done this homework so well. They've got hundreds of use cases lined up, one after another, in a chronological order. So in that discipline, with the infrastructure and the right organization and the cultural flavor, things do happen and bear results.
Good. It's an interesting one, because, so a lot of the focus of, the words that are being used around analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, they're all things that obviously have great promise for the industry. And Arshad, you mentioned that you come at this from a subsurface perspective. And in this area where these things may not resonate as much with folks who are working on the reservoir, where you're working with more physical models. One of the great questions I have is, how do you marry these two approaches? Yeah. A reservoir engineer, what they're doing reservoir simulation, is going to argue that they are doing digital transformation. how do you begin to take some of these new tools and begin to incorporate them into
Yeah.
existing workflows?
It's a great question, and I think, we believe that machine learning and modeling should be physics-based, right? It's not an either or. We're not saying that non-physics models don't work. We're not saying only physics-based models work. The magic is in sort of bringing them together, right? So in subsurface, and it's not just subsurface, it goes beyond that, there are these existing models that have existed for a long time. There is the subsurface, the Earth model, right, which was built with solid physics-based measurements, seismic and so on. And then there's real data from production that sits at the surface. Those two worlds haven't coexisted before. But what we are finding is that those physics-based models are now being injected with machine learning and analytics. So let me give you an example. We now have technology and deep learning applied to the way we interpret seismic data, right? The way we process seismic data. What it does is two things. One, it actually speeds up the process of interpreting and processing that data. We have automated many tasks that required people sitting at a workstation and picking faults and horizons in data. And as seismic data has become much more high definition and much higher in volumes, it was just physically getting cumbersome for people to pick those factoids by hand. While having machine learn how to pick those patterns has been a great productivity multiplier in our space. And it's really relevant because of shortage of talent and time and speed for making decisions. So there is application of machine learning, deep learning into physical side of the world, which is making the world more productive. But also it's actually making it more accurate. You can now you can actually teach these algorithms how to look for patterns in one set of data, and then you can run it on a set of other seismic data. It will go look for those patterns, and as it does that, it becomes smarter and smarter and smarter. So I think this idea that, and there are some companies who truly do take more of a non-physics-based approach, and our view is that it has to be properly balanced with physics-based modeling for it to truly work. And I'll just say one more thing, Jed, if it's okay. It's a little bit tangential here, but I think it's important for this discussion because I really like the way you were talking about creating value and showing benefits, because there's a real risk here that this industry goes out, spends a bunch of money building a platform, right? Without, nobody's ever made money. Nobody's ever gotten money from platforms. You need applications, you need real use cases to create business value. And if you look at unconventional sector today, and what happened in the last 4 or 5 years, what you've seen is tremendous reduction in costs. Most of those cost reductions have come through just better supply chain management, right? People beating up their vendors. I was at a panel with a bunch of CEOs, and the CEO of a railroad company said, we have reduced the cost of sand, by 70%, right? And somebody else stood up and said, we have negotiated better contracts with the drillers and so on. I think that game has been played out, right? The next round of cost cutting will come from more intelligent decision making. And for that, you need to not use cheap sand, you need to use less sand. You need to drill fewer fracs. There are some data which shows 70% of cost of a horizontal well is fracking. And only half of them produce much of anything, right? Yeah. So magically, if you only fracked half of them, you save 30% of your cost. I'm not sure the statistics are correct, but they are generally correct. But applying analytics, applying physical models can really help you lower those costs. And I think create use cases which truly create value very quickly, and you don't have to wait to build a platform, which may take many years.
Interesting. And it's one, and certainly, and probably something I should have said in the introductory as well, is that, this, I think people have squeezed it out, right? We've gotten the efficiency, we've gotten the cost gains over the last 3 years.
Right.
And I think if we look on the drilling side, if we look on the production optimization side, that next squeezing out is likely going to be, it's not going to come from squeezing more in the supply chain. It's going to come from doing things better, and that's largely around digitalization. And I like this is an interesting one. So the kind of the platforms, the platform approach. And you talked about platforms never delivered value, right? It's the apps, it's the modules on top of those. So the question I have is, where does this? You talked about some pretty gnarly problems, doing reservoir simulation. Is the value in kind of solving these really gnarly problems, getting teams of 10 to 15 data scientists together to solve these, or is the value in kind of giving these tools to your broader workforce and allowing these animal spirits of of your workforce? And maybe Shamila, maybe you can speak to that. Where do you see? Are you focusing on let's solve these really difficult problems, or let's get these tools out to our workforce, because we know once they get their hands on these, they're going to be able to come up with some pretty cool things?
We do both, actually.
Okay.
We are very outcome-led. What are the business pain points or use cases that we want to tackle? And those would be our roadmap, if you like, on how we want to journey in this digital transformation. Now, but at the same time, there's a lot of interest across the group, across all employees, to participate and contribute. Now, you can't hold back that kind of enthusiasm and say, wait, your turn will come as we do the use cases. So what we do is actually, for example, analytics. We have an initiative which we call Democratizing Analytics, making available tools, algorithm models that takes minimal coding and visualization toolkit that would allow more people to partake in it. And we call it trying to create this digital movement across the group. Yeah. Because there's so much energy and interest, and as I said earlier, you can't hold that back, because you're dealing, after all, in innovation space. And so it's a fine balance of driving centrally the kind of efforts that would create great value which you can scale, at the same time enabling an ecosystem for the group, the entire group, to participate in this digital transformation.
And it's a great question, and I'll extend it to John as well. Did you see this, from on the drilling side? Where do you see the value? Is it both? Is it kind of you have a central group that kind of works on this? And then leading to that, I think an interesting question is around where does the value lie? Is it in the intellectual property? So when you develop these tools, these algorithms, do you protect these as the crown jewels of the company? Or are these things that you're willing, it's more in the application and the use of these tools, and you're willing to put them out and commercialize them to allow them to be developed, maintained?
Yeah, to answer the first question, second question first. Yeah, in fact, we've started to license our tools because it's the application, we believe. On the other piece, it's quite interesting, is when my children misbehave, I turn to my wife and say, I blame the parents. And they go, oh, it's good, it's us. But it's about where do you create capability in the organization for digital? It's not about your new hires or graduates coming in. You've got to permeate the whole organization. So it's a management issue of whenever you're trying to take a decision, where's my digital element, what's my angle, and trying to get that into the culture of consideration. Because originally we were looking at it as a sort of a recruitment problem. We suddenly didn't know, that'll solve the problem in 40 years' time. We've actually got a continuous education problem that we need to deal with.
What do you so with Maana's tools, Babur, are you, or with analytics tools in general? I mean, do you see the kind of the flourishing of these, and are people holding them tight? Is this where their intellectual property lies, or are they willing to, as John said, which I think is fascinating, by the way, and I don't want to lose that point, is that, that you're developing these tools internally and then you're willing to commercialize and license and allow your peers, let's call them your peers, be able to use them as well, which I think is a real interesting development that we've seen taking place over the last few years. But Babur, when people use the tools around analytics, where do you see? Do you see like this, kind of loosening up of, kind of allowing them to kind of get out and really determining where does our competitive advantage lie?
Yeah, I mean, we see, depending on the use case, at the same customer, like Shell's a good example, some of the use cases, digital use cases they develop, they consider actually licensing it to the whole industry through partnership, but some they keep it to themselves. So that's a preference depending on the use case. What we see very repetitively in health, environment, safety area, everybody wants to share. So that's
And you
one
see that as
area.
well, Shamila?
That's one area. I think everybody wants to even share the data as well, not just the tools, but the data. So that's interesting. We're looking at it, of course. And if they could do that, they can revolutionize looking at not just one industry, but mining, minerals, and construction. Many follows from there. Yeah.
Well, so that's a good segue. So Vivek, one of the questions I have is so you get to look across multiple industries. Where does oil and gas lie? So Babur brought up all these other sectors. Are we kind of a 8 or 9, A plus?
I should be careful about how I answer that. No, so if you'd asked me that last year, I would have said, we lag in general in the space of digital transformations. We are very good at digitizing a piece of our business, but we don't look across the board and look at the entire system and try and manage the entire system together. Now I would say we've taken significant strides towards that direction. Many companies are starting to say, look, I understand that I'm set up in a way that doesn't allow me to optimize the whole system. Therefore, I do have to optimize pieces of it because there is value to digitizing that piece. But once I do that, I plug it into other parts of my business. I link up the information that is flowing from production to development, and I start to optimize the entire system. So, the short answer is I would say we are probably in the middle of the pack and maybe a little bit below the middle of the pack.
I feel better.
But
Okay,
not at the
Okay.
very bottom as we used to be.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. This interface, I think, is you're kind of talking about the interfaces across. John, you're obviously focused on the well construction. You got your head down. You're working hard to get that right. And I'm not sure what the pace of digitalization is across the Shell portfolio more broadly. But do you find that as you kind of push forward, it makes those interfaces easier? And the great example I think of, the value in upstream oil and gas is being able to, the decisions you make during the drilling phase, what impact does that have on production? Are you able to do that now, or is that kind of what you're working for, and kind of where are the interfaces to the other groups within Shell that you're really trying to make them where you see the value?
Yeah, there is a pace issue, and I think so. One of the things we've said is that look, by the program, we hope by next year to shrink our deepwater design time down to maybe 5 weeks, and conservatively, the ambition is about 2 weeks. And then you say, okay, well, the rest of the organization got to flex with me. So now my supply chain looks very different because I don't have a luxury of a year anymore to plan that. And then my petroleum engineering teams need to go at the same pace. And so I think there's a bit of us acting as a catalyst around that, because you can't just sit back and say, well, I'll just wait for everybody else. So you embarrass the rest of the organization by being ahead of the game. So there are different levels of maturity. In the subsurface, it's interesting that it's the last bastion of art, and whenever I push my geologists, you can't rush art, and so it's and I think that's always right. There's AI, screaming in the face if that's what people claim.
Okay, and it's in the interfaces as well. I mean, one of the things I do want to get into is the supply chain, and you kind of look, and Shamila, maybe turn to you here, but as you begin to work with your traditional suppliers and vendors, do you see an opportunity as kind of this transparency that Arshad was talking about is kind of increased? Is there an opportunity for them to begin to deliver goods and services and behave differently than they have in the past? Whether that's within one part of the energy segment or kind of across the board.
No, I think whatever we do in Petronas will spill over, for example, to the oil and gas industry in Malaysia. And it would serve us well as well. So whatever we do in analytics, we can share with other producers that operate in Malaysia, because at the end of the day, it's about raising the level of performance, and everyone would gain. So I think we are like a catalyst, Petronas in Malaysia, to spur similar innovative way to deploy digital in the space in Malaysia.
Okay. Arshad, for Emerson more broadly as well, does this change? Is this changing the game?
Yeah.
So are you kind of, whether it's some the business models or service models?
I mean, I was in a meeting this morning with an EPC partner of ours. We supply a lot of equipment to this company, and they were discussing these mega projects with end customers, $500 million projects, right? There's one team that builds the plant, and then another team that operates it, right? and the decisions being made at the planning stage, which affect the cost for the next 40 years of operating that plant. Yet the team that's planning and constructing the plant, their incentives is to have the lowest cost possible, right? But you want to make certain investments in digital and so on at the design phase that will lower the cost in the operational phase. And I'm just talking about the same company with two divisions, right? And they want us to provide them with all the digital twins of the equipment that we supply to them, right? Because that's the platform they're trying to build. But you can extend that beyond that company, right? It affects not just the two teams within this operator, the build and design team, or design and build team, and the operate team. It also projects out to the supply chain, right? So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here for entrepreneurs who are here to think about how do you facilitate digitization at a micro level, right? So you think about the need to digitize all these parts, the term that they use, digital twin, right? How many of those digital twins actually exist today? And is there an opportunity for somebody to go create those digital parts for either Emerson or for the suppliers or to the contractors or to the operator? And there are going to be lots of these little, which may not look big to companies, some of the big companies on the stage, but for an entrepreneur, for a smaller company, there are great opportunities to go after that.
Interesting. Okay. And you see, it's so broad. I mean, the opportunity, whether it's parts, whether it's kind of the supply chain. And John, I'm going to turn to you and ask as well. I mean, we heard it. I was at a session this morning where they were talking about we think that we can reduce drilling costs and well construction costs, which is such a significant component of overall E&P spend, by anywhere from 30 to 50% by doing some of these things. And I'm going to ask you, so are there new models that you see and kind of how you interface with your supply chain? And you know the word I'm going to ask you to use.
Yes.
But do you see new models that you're kind of pushing forward and spurring forward?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, what's the size of the prize for us? And so one way we dimensioned it is we took, if we look at our best-in-class wells, what kind of price do we get in the markets? And then we said, okay, let's decompose our best-in-class well into the best bits. And what does that number look like? And that number looks like 10 to 40% lower than our best wells, which is a pretty good standard. Our best wells are a pretty good standard anyway. And so our thesis is what's driving the variation in that space? Now, there is some natural variation just because of geology, but quite a lot of that variation is done by the way we interact with our suppliers and the way we interact with our staff, the way we learn, the way we give instructions. So we feel as though we can attack that level of cost. There is another piece about what's the market orchestrator in this space, and you see in the Permian some models evolving of people controlling the invoicing for small suppliers for water delivery, and so what's the Uberization? I said the word.
Thank you.
In this space. And so one example, which is a bad example, is that all companies all around the world buy large amounts of salt, typically for drilling mud, but also for chemicals. So we've got this enormous ecosystem of salt buying, and it's often by specialist suppliers. Now, is there an Uberization around the supply of salt to the oil business? And is there a partner in Walmart or Amazon in that space to sort of open it up? Now, salt's not the best idea, but that kind of idea surely is another way to take more than that 40% out of the cost. Okay. And the industry is inefficient. If you look at the improvement in efficiency, for instance, in the auto industry over the last 10 years, it's really significant compared to almost flat line of productivity in the oil business. And so the real world is moving around us. And that's the advantage we have, is that we can skip a generation of technology or ideas. We can jump to a new set of tools. So I think it's all there. It's all up to us to deliver at the end of the day. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to turn a little bit. We got the Slido. We got my iPad that I'm looking at. I'm not surfing the web here. But we're looking at some of the questions. So I did want to turn to some of the questions that the audience is asking. I think we're going to go that route. But I'll ask one, and I think it's great. Uberization leads us into mobility, and mobility leads us into liability. So are there any questions as we go? And maybe Babur, you kind of bring this one up to you, but this is one that was kind of top of the list now. But are we, as you kind of shift towards artificial intelligence, machine learning to make decisions, if something goes wrong, have we thought through, are there any legal liability issues, or is this just, kind of the same game that, the ones with the deepest pockets are the most liable?
Not that I know in legal way, but there is if you take a use case and that use case consumes a reasonable amount of AI-capable algorithms, the consumer of the use case themselves want to know how the algorithms come to that decisions before full adoption of it. So there is a period of believing what the machine is saying, and if you've designed those use cases and algorithms smartly, and that's not always the case, but you can provide some type of an audit trail. So there is, not legal that we know, but there is from the final end users, is some level of something to believe the algorithm is making the right suggestion or decision.
Well, I'll continue on that thread because I agree, and certainly whether it's the drilling folks or the subsurface folks, there is, the receptivity to black box devices is not always very high. So does that mean, do you open, Arshad, would Emerson open its code to your customers so that they understand the algorithms, or are you protective? Is that your intellectual property?
Well, we are actually, well, it's case by case. So we do have customers who get to see our code. But there is a clear movement towards more openness, okay? And it's not just about opening up your software or your platform, it's also opening yourself to new ideas. So one of the things we are doing a lot in my business is we call it innovation services. And the idea is that historically companies like Shell and others have spent a lot of money on R&D internally in developing their own secret sauce. With this downturn and the pace of innovation going up, many of them have realized that it's better for them to partner. So we actually go out and actively work on developing new algorithms. And in most cases, they're open to even sharing them. I mean, it's amazing that they would let that go to their competitors. Not everybody, but we are seeing more openness around that. And I'll just make another point. I think, I don't know if we're going to get to it later on, Judd, but I do think that when you talk about what needs to be different moving forward, and as somebody mentioned the ecosystem point, I think it's critical that we recognize as an industry that we are not going to get there on our own, right? We talk a lot to the big cloud companies who come here and talk to us about, or somebody from, with no industry background shows up, and we have this new black box idea of finding, oil, right? I think we need to recognize that there is some unique set of capabilities that different players offer. So it's the cloud companies who are building more and more of the AI stack on their cloud platforms. There are the operators. And then there are the services companies and equipment companies. They all have to come together and be more open, right? And be willing to share their insights and share their data in some cases, which they won't always, right? But I think that needs to happen for us to get to where we need to get to as an industry. Without that, I think we're stuck.
And Shamila, do you find, is there a preference as you begin to develop some of your tools and develop some of these off the shelf, buying off the shelf from partners or suppliers, or is there a preference to developing internally as you kind of go down this road?
Well, we adopt what we call open standard principle, because the issue with off the shelf is, it's changing so fast and evolving so fast. So just to make sure that what we want to do and the pace we want to do it, to synchronize it with off-the-shelf solution may be a bit hard. So we want to pull the best of breed, if you like, almost like a Lego block that we can pull as when we need it and what we need. So it's a more open standard principle that we deploy.
Okay. So Vivek, are we there? To all these points, the sharing, the development, plug and play, being able to work. Are we there around kind of data ownership, data access? Are we? This, I guess, isn't a legal or liability, but is the contract, is the ownership issues in place to be able to kind of move to this new place?
We've done a lot to think through it, but I don't think we've gotten all of the issues worked out, both on the liability side, on the sharing side, and eventually on the security side, right? At the field level, security, when we have all these automation protocols in place, when we have the analytics in place, how do we make it secure? What are the liabilities associated with that? How does those break? We haven't answered all those. And I don't expect us to answer them, in one go, right? This will be evolutionary. It'll move along over time, and it'll have both sides, right? It's both the operators and the service providers and the ecosystem coming together to answer it.
Okay. One of the things, when I think about digitalization, I think about, okay, well, what is, we were promised flying cars, right? So what's the flying car in oil and gas? And it's one of the questions here, but it's around the automated drilling rig. We can just put a drilling rig on the site, and then you kind of go off and get a cup of coffee, and it drills a well for you. John, one of the questions around, where are we on this journey? Are you going to promise us the flying car, and or are we still many years away in terms of not only automated but fully autonomous drilling operations?
So, yeah, our history is that my team actually ran an autonomous drilling project for directional drilling, and again, we're a little bit ahead of our time in that the infrastructure that we need to support just meant that it wasn't. Initially, when we started, we could beat the average directional drilling in the Permian by about 30%. What was interesting as the downtime came in, we could only start beating by about 10%, and our rig strategy changed to turning over every year. So that meant our payoff time was about 8 months, and it became less of a brilliant option. But what's happened in the meantime is that drilling systems on rigs have evolved, and so now you can put an artificial intelligence layer on a lot of the rig systems, so it's coming back. And there's autonomous drilling, and then there's also the physical, the makeup of drill pipe and manipulation. And those things are all available in pieces in the industry. I have a question in my own mind about whether that's the most efficient thing to go for. But one of the things is that Shell's drilling organization makes or breaks connections about 2 million times per annum. Mm-hmm. And you say, well, that's like our number one product as a drilling organization. And you say, well, how much control have you got over it? And when we look at the real data, there's an enormous spread. So is there something there? There is. The question is that, does the investment make sense? We have one offshore drilling contractor who has an automatic connection system, but we're arguing about the liability some 6 months later from that capability. And it's interesting how, the industry is conservative in this space.
Yeah. Agree. So we're getting near the end, but what I wanted to do is, so this is the second year that we've that we've done Agora. I'm sure it's a great success. We'll keep on doing it. So when we all get together in 5 years from now, maybe in 15 seconds, you can tell me, and I'll start with you, Arshad, because I know you've already thought this through. But maybe when we get together in 5 years from now, what's changed? What have we actually done? What have we accomplished? What does the world look like?
I think there'll be players who would have made a lot. There would be a big separation between the leaders and the laggards, is my prediction. I think everybody will move up the technology curve to some extent. And the fact is not everybody need to move at the same pace, but there will be a big separation. And we see that today.
Is that suppliers or is that suppliers?
I'm talking about the operators.
Operators.
I'm talking about the operators. I think even within the shale, you see a cluster of these operators who are head and shoulders above everybody else. They made the transition from looking at shale purely as a manufacturing play to saying this is really a data and science-driven play. Yes, you need to check the box in manufacturing and logistics and everything. And I think you'll see that separation happen. And it will be all these technologies we talked about that will separate them.
Excellent. Shamila.
I think the players that will stay relevant 5 years from now are those that fundamentally change the way they work, really re-engineering and not going for just incremental improvements. So those are the players that are still relevant 5 years from now.
So not just new work, not just the existing work process, but new work process.
Fundamental change in the way we work.
Okay. John, are we still drilling wells? Are we?
We hope so.
It's not that quick. Yeah. I think it's interesting because we're talking about liability. I think it'll start to become unacceptable to have things like process safety decisions where there's not an artificial intelligence component actually helping us advise. because it holds more knowledge than an individual. I think the other thing you'll see in the oil business, and it's an interesting shift, is what I realize is a lot of the knowledge in the oil business is held in people's heads. There are not that many good books on how the actual business is run. And I think what you'll see in the next 5 years is a shift from knowledge in people's heads into much more into the systems. So there's going to be a real change in the dynamic of the business, and that ability to learn faster and changing the demographic. I think that's going to be interesting to see how this pans out. So.
Okay, Babur.
I see a fairly different angle. If this is successful, digitization, companies who are purely trying to provide into that space would have taken companies like Schlumberger or Halliburton out of business. But I'm serious.
I like that. I like that.
It's just, if this is happening, that's what should happen.
Great. Vivek?
I think fundamentally we'll have a much deeper understanding of how decisions in one space in our business influence a different part of the value chain. Whether that is planning on an operator's side influencing the cost structure of an OFS player, or if it is drilling influencing some production, we'll have a fundamentally better understanding of it, and the decisions we'll be making will be optimized in a much broader way than we do today.
Fantastic. With that, we'll close it out, and thank you to the panel, and great discussion.